Hello. The Divine Code reading for November 6th, pages 303 and 304. We are in the chapter Permissions and Prohibitions Commanded to Gentiles regarding meat. Species for which meat of a living animal is forbidden. Topic number 11. When the prohibition applies, a Gentile is liable for punishment for even eating the slightest amount of edible part, a limb, organ, flesh, fat, etc., that was taken from the living animal. So it says when the prohibition applies is not a temporal thing. It's in the case of where it's an animal and it's considered meat taken from a living animal. So when the prohibition applies, okay, this is because Gentiles are not subject to the principle of a Torah precept involving forbidden food that does not make one liable for liable for physical punishment unless a minimum amount of the food is eaten. There's a principle in Torah that when a lot of the Jewish commandments, there is a minimum amount that must be done in order for it to fall as a Torah prohibition. And then the rabbis come along and they even allow not that much. They then take that minimum amount away as a rabbinic commandment, but in order for it to be a Torah violation, it would have to meet a minimum amount. It would have to be like the size of an olive or whatever it is in that case. This principle of measurements does not exist in Noahide law. When we're dealing with Noahide law, such as the prohibition against stealing, there's no minimum amount. In the Jewish law, they speak of the pruta. That's like a penny. It's the smallest amount of denomination. So something to be stolen would have to meet that amount. Anything less than that amount would be inconsequential. That principle does not exist in the Noahide law. In the Noahide law, the prohibition against stealing would apply to any amount, even if it's less than a penny. Likewise, in the prohibition against Abraham Achai for a Noahide, there has to be any amount, even the slightest taste would be considered, just the slightest little particle would be considered the Torah violation. And that's assuming the person is aware that that's what he's doing. So if it's the tiniest amount that gets mixed in, he's not aware of it, therefore it would not be covered. But if he's aware of it, the tiniest amount is not allowed. That would fall under, the being aware of it would also be one of the aspects of when the prohibition applies. So this concept exists in other areas of Noahide law also, that there's no minimum measurement in Noahide law. Blood from a living animal is not included in this prohibition. Rambam, the Laws of Kings 9:10, and the exclamation of Keshev Mishnah. I'm not sure why it's in this topic, but yeah, okay. So now for example, a Gentile may drink blood that had already been extracted from a living animal, or cause an animal to bleed if he requires its blood for health purposes. He is, however, forbidden to cause an animal to bleed for the sake of drinking its blood as ordinary food, because of the suffering he will cause the animal. After the fact, however, a Gentile may consume blood that was collected in this manner. So he's causing distress on the animal to take the blood from an animal. It's not considered meat. There's certain criteria for what is considered meat. considered limb of a living animal, and blood would not be considered in the criteria of a limb of a living animal. It's forbidden because it would be considered causing distress on the animal, whether it's the pain involved in losing the blood or if it's the stress placed on the animal system for not having the blood. And for that reason, we're not permitted to do that. However, once the blood is taken away, it's not considered a limb of a living animal, and therefore it would be permitted to be consumed. The consumption is not the issue; it's the drawing that's the issue. The drawing of the blood that's the issue. It appears, however, that the prohibition of drawing blood from the animal for the sake of drinking applies only if so much blood is drawn from the animal that the animal may die as a result. But drawing a small amount of blood from an animal in a way that will definitely not result in its death is permitted, provided the person has an actual need for its blood. That's for drinking or for medical purposes. This is because there is no Torah-based prohibition for causing pain to animals in a situation where a person is in actual need of it, for it, as will be explained below in chapter 7. So if there's a need, and whether it's he just enjoys drinking blood and therefore he wants to drink the blood, that may not be considered a need. But if he needs it because he's actually the person is actually maybe starving, and they're out in the wilderness, and he needs to drink some of the blood, that might be permitted in that case. But if it's a normal situation where there's no real need for it, then it would not be permitted to draw the blood from the animal. The prohibition of eating Aver Mem Hakai applies to meat removed from a living domesticated animal, wild land mammals, and birds of any species. However, a Gentile is liable for a capital sin only for eating Aver Mem Hakai from meat from mammals in the specified conditions explained in the next topic and also in chapter 3, but not from birds. And that's also explained in Rambam, the Laws of Kings 9:10, and the exclamation of Kesef Mishnah. So there is a question about whether or not birds are included. Generally speaking, birds are considered to be included in the commandment of prohibition of Aver Mem Hakai. But because there is a question about it, it would not be a death penalty. Death penalty is only in cases where there's no rabbinic argument regarding a law. So because there's a rabbinic argument, there's a strong rabbinic argument concerning the question of birds. Birds are prohibited, but it would not be a death penalty violation. Whereas domesticated mammals and wild land mammals would be included in the prohibition as a death penalty. After cutting off flesh from a living topic number 12. After cutting off flesh from a living animal, although cutting off flesh from a living animal is included in both the prohibitions of Aver Mem Hakai, as cutting off the flesh is also prohibited, but it is not only forbidden to cut off flesh from a living animal to eat it while the animal is still alive, it is also forbidden to cut off flesh from a living animal and then eat it after the animal dies. So there's two different issues here. One issue is the cutting off of the flesh, and the other issue is the prohibition of eating the flesh of a living animal. The cutting off of a flesh is a second issue, and it needs to be viewed. You know, it needs to each issue needs to be viewed separately from each other in order to properly understand it. The proof of this is, and that's also in chapter number 3 in this book, in footnote 71, and that'll be in the future next week's reading somewhere. If a Jew makes a kosher slaughter and the animal is still convulsing, it is permitted for the Gentile to cut off a piece of it. It is nonetheless forbidden for a Gentile to eat the severed flesh until the animal dies. For there's no leniency to set aside the command from God to the Gentiles in Genesis 9:4. So there is, okay, so the main commandment is not to eat the limb of a living animal. That cannot change in that regard. You can't come up with an oddball scenario unless it's a medical necessity, but otherwise there's no oddball scenario that would say we're going to allow that. However, in the other issue of not severing the limb of a living animal, which is connected with not causing suffering to animals, there can be ways of workaround for that. But a Gentile is not allowed to cut off flesh of an animal killed by piercing or some other non-kosher means of killing. So this is a specific instance, this unique situation is in a specific instance of a kosher slaughter. While its limbs are still convulsing. So he cannot cut the limb off if you go into a normal goyishka slaughterhouse where they're using stun guns or bolts in the head or whatever it is that they use in a goyishka slaughterhouse, if that animal is still twitching, it's still moving about, we're not permitted to take flesh from that animal. And that's even if he will not eat the flesh until after the limbs stop convulsing. We thus see that it is surely forbidden for a Gentile to commit half the transgression and cut off a piece of an animal while it is still alive and healthy. So we learn from this law that if it's not permitted to take the flesh off an animal that is still convulsing after receiving a goyishka slaughter, then definitely we're not allowed to do it while it's still alive, while it's in a normal day. The only reason permission is given for a Gentile to sever an animal's flesh immediately after kosher slaughter is that there's a principle: what is permitted for Jews is surely permitted for Gentiles, as long as it does not transgress a command from God. So in this case, the non-Jew has a prohibition against cutting the limb off a living animal. This is not a strict Torah prohibition. This is more of a logical, we shouldn't be doing this kind of stuff, kind of prohibition. Therefore, in the case of a logical, we shouldn't be doing this kind of stuff prohibition, there are ways of finding examples where we could do it. Whereas in a clear commandment from God, such as not eating the limb of a living animal, that's a clear command. It goes beyond rationality. to the extent that even if we find some logical reason, well, we shouldn't do it unless it's a medical necessity, which kind of pushes aside most of the commandments. But we shouldn't find workarounds for actual Torah commands. But in the case of a logical command, such as not cutting a limb off a living animal because it causes suffering, that there's ways to find other ways around it. Rambam differs and says it is never permitted for a Gentile, and that's also in footnote 75 below. That's in chapter 3, which will be sometime next week, I think. So there is opinion. In this case, the Rambam would be a minority opinion, but he's still a very strong opinion that would say no, it's never permitted for a non-Jew to take limb off a living animal, even take the limb off a animal that is in the throes of a kosher, immediately after kosher slaughter while it's still twitching. The Rambam would say it's never permitted. Though one can conjecture that the main prohibition is on cutting off flesh while the animal is still alive. Again, that will be discussed in chapter 3. It is not logical to say that piercing, etc., while the animal is still it is not logical to say the sages extended this prohibition to cutting flesh from an animal killed by piercing, etc., while the animal was still convulsing. Rather, the actual cutting off of flesh is forbidden as long as eating the flesh would be forbidden. So here it's explaining how this difference works with regard to the animal that is there's a number of variables here, and there's a certain amount of uncertainty as to whether or not it doesn't actually say it in the divine code, but there's an uncertainty as to whether or not it's prohibited for a Gentile to eat the flesh of an animal that was severed from an animal. While okay, the question is, this animal goes through a kosher slaughter. That means it has its esophagus and its trachea cut according to the kosher manner, and it's still twitching. It hasn't become, it still has some animate to it. Technically, although it's generally forbidden anyway, but technically it would be possible to take a flesh from that animal and eat the flesh at that point. It shouldn't be done, and therefore the rabbis say we're not going to permit it. Now the question is, where is the actual demarcation between what would be Torah law, the clear commandment from God, and the myriad of rabbinic commandments, oftentimes one on top of the other, that it's very hard to distinguish between what's the rabbinic commands and what is the Torah command from God. And it would seem in this case that in the case of kosher slaughter, it would be permitted to eat the limb of the living animal as the animal is still convulsing. It's not permitted rabbinically in that case, and therefore it would not be permitted rabbinically to remove the limb at that point. And the Rambam says that that's just of such a strong nature that of course it's not allowed. Or maybe he doesn't allow, Rambam does not allow the issue of what is permitted for a Jew or what is not forbidden for a Jew would not be forbidden to a non-Jew. He may not apply that in this case. So there's a difference of opinion about that. But rabbinically, everybody would agree that at some point this should not be permitted. I mean, just by any decency, it should not be permitted. Even though technically it would not be a Torah violation, it would not be a death penalty violation at this point. A Gentile is not liable for capital punishment unless he eats from the severed flesh while the animal is still alive. In the verse Genesis 9:4, but flesh with its soul, its blood, you shall not eat, indicates that a Gentile's transgression is one of God's commandments to know only if he eats from the flesh of the animal that is still alive. So going back to the kosher slaughter, the question is whether or not that animal, after it receives the kosher slaughter, is still considered alive. Now, biologically, somebody from PETA is going to put a video up showing an animal that had received kosher slaughter. It's still twitching, and everyone freaks out at the video. But halachically, assuming it was a kosher slaughter, that animal is considered dead for the purpose of halakha, which is what we're studying. We're not studying biology, we're studying halakha. And so that animal would be considered dead. Now, the animal in the next building over that's getting the goyishka, electric shock or whatever they're doing to kill the animal over there, that animal is still twitching. That animal is considered alive. That's just the way it's That's just the way it works. But one who cuts off flesh but does not eat it from it is not liable for the penalty. If a person severs the flesh of another and another person eats it, the liability only applies to the one who eats the flesh. The person who transgresses by severing the flesh but does not eat from it is not liable for capital punishment. So we're seeing here that there might be an issue of cruelty to animals, even in the case of kosher slaughter. If they start hacking off limbs of the kosher slaughter, the now halachically dead animal, there may still be issues regarding animal cruelty if they start hacking off the limbs while the animal's convulsing. But that's a totally separate issue. And removing the limbs of an animal while the animal is still alive, if it's in the farm and it's alive, and there's no question it's alive, hacking limbs off that animal is an issue of animal cruelty. It's prohibited, but it would not be considered a death penalty prohibition. It's only considered a death penalty prohibition if a person eats that flesh. And that could even mean that somebody else cuts the limb off. One person cuts the limb off. A second person eats the limb, flesh from that limb. The second person who didn't do any cruelty to the animal, but the second person violated the prohibition. Therefore, we see that the prohibition is the eating of the limb. It's not the animal cruelty that's the Torah death penalty violation. This is very important in halakha to understand the distinction between logic and Torah halakha. It's not based on the law is not based on the necessity to be nice to animals. We can learn that from the law, but that's not what it's based on. Since the Torah places the liability exclusively on the eater of the detached flesh of a live animal, the manner in which the flesh was removed is of no consequence. Accordingly, a Gentile who eats from Abraham Hakai while the animal is still alive is liable regardless of whether the flesh was removed by him or another. or even if it became detached because of injury, disease, or any other reason. For example, a part of it was removed during an operation to cure the animal or remove tail. So even if the animal is, it's not a case of cruelty to remove something that is necessary for the benefit of the animal. They're removing something that otherwise the animal would suffer. So they're being nice to the animal in this case by removing that limb, that piece of flesh. They're removing it and they're being nice to the animal. If another person eats that flesh while the animal is still alive, that would be considered a Torah violation. That would be a death penalty. So it's very clear that the Torah violation, that's a death penalty, is the consumption of the flesh of a living animal, of a still living animal, without any regard as to how that flesh was obtained. The eating of that flesh is the Torah violation. Thank you.